The United States Navy was frankly essential to the Allied victory in the Second World War. The war in the Pacific was largely an operation of the U.S. Navy, but even in Europe, the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union likely would have been knocked out of the war were it not for the U.S. Navy's essential role in securing supply lines. The great amphibious invasions of the Second World War were only possible because of the amphibious fleet and the logistical support of the United States Navy. But the Navy itself was really only made possible because of the vision and political prowess of a congressman who grew up nowhere near the sea. You might never have heard his name, or if you did, had no idea what he did, but without Carl Vinson, the world, and certainly the U.S. Navy, might have been very different. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the goal was to so cripple the U.S. fleet that the U.S. could not block their conquest of the Dutch East Indies and Malaya. The Japanese attack sunk or crippled 8 U.S. battleships, the vast bulk of the U.S. capital ships in the Pacific, as well as doing significant damage to cruisers and destroyers and destroying hundreds of aircraft. But it didn't quite work out as Japan planned. Just a year after the attack, and despite the losses from fighting in 1942, the U.S. surface warship fleet had increased by nearly 60 ships. On December 31, 1942, the USS Essex, the most advanced aircraft carrier of the era and the lead ship of a whopping 24-ship class, was commissioned. By the end of December 1943, the surface warship fleet of the U.S. was nearly 3 times what it was on December 7, 1941, including 19 fleet carriers and 35 escort carriers. While 6 of the 8 battleships sunk or damaged at Pearl Harbor had returned to service, they were largely outdated, replaced by the South Dakota and Iowa-class battle wagons. By the end of the war, the U.S. Navy had grown from roughly 740 active ships to more than 6,700 active ships. By the end of the war, the U.S. Navy had more large ships than all other navies on Earth combined. But naval development takes many years. How was the U.S. able to respond so quickly? Because the Navy that would win the war was already under construction before the war began. And that was largely thanks to Georgia Congressman Carl Vinson. Vinson attended Mercer University Law School and was admitted to the bar in 1902. He served as a county prosecutor, a member of the Georgia State House of Representatives, and as a judge of the county court of Baldwin County before running for Congress in a special election in 1914. Winning the election handily, he was just short of his 31st birthday, the youngest member of Congress serving at the time. Andrea Honecker notes in the Mercer University News website The Den that before joining Congress in 1914, Vinson had never been to Washington, D.C. Vinson would go on to serve as the representative for Georgia's 10th and then later 6th congressional districts for 50 years and 1 month, then a record, although it has since been eclipsed. James F. Cook writes in the New Georgia Encyclopedia, competent and hard-working, he became a fixture in Congress. After defeating the former populist leader Thomas E. Watson in 1918, he rarely faced opposition. Vinson was so successful because he served his district and its largest city, Macon. A 1935 edition of the Macon, Georgia News notes that Vinson had secured many work relief projects, and it was through his efforts that the headquarters of the Regional Agricultural Credit Corporations, the headquarters of the Seed Loan Organization, and the headquarters of the Navy Recruiting Service for Georgia and Florida were brought to Macon, as well as the headquarters of the Marine Recruiting Service for the whole Southeastern Territory. Vinson was, the news reported, responsible for getting the funding for Macon's magnificent Spring Street Bridge and establishing the nearby Ocmulgee National Monument, now Ocmulgee Mounds National Historical Park. Vinson had even ensured that the Navy's new rigid airship, the pride of the Navy, was named USS Macon. Vinson was, the paper opines, the only representative to Congress we had in 40 years who even knew that Macon was on the map. Georgians would come to refer to him over his long career as Uncle Carl. These sorts of achievements are what you would expect of a local congressman and certainly had to contribute to his being reelected 26 consecutive times. But Vinson was no hot dog. Rather, Cook's notes, a modest man of simple taste, Vinson shunned the limelight and quietly did his duty. But Vinson's most notable legacy wasn't in what he secured for his district, but something rather distant from his landlocked part of Georgia. Vinson became known among the armed forces as the Admiral for his unwavering support for the Navy. On May 27, 1916, he spoke on the House floor, advocating for the 1916 Naval Act. Called the Big Navy Act, the act occurred in the midst of the war in Europe. But the act was not in preparation so much as it was for recognition that the U.S. needed larger ships to protect its interests in an increasingly dangerous world. In his support for the bill, Vinson enunciated for the first time his vision for military preparedness that would characterize his congressional career. I am a hater of war and a devoted lover of peace. But, sir, Mr. Chairman, in my hour of seclusion and study, I have, to the best of my humble capacity, held up the lamp of the past to the face of the future. And I call God to witness that I would be recreant and faithless to my conscience and to the people who have honored me with their suffrage, and the 100 million American citizens of the Republic, which you and I and my other colleagues represent in this greatest lawmaking body on earth, if I did not proclaim, as far as my voice will reach, that I am fully convinced and realize that peace to be had must sometimes be battled for, that to be preserved it must be guarded and protected, and that to be protected, it must be surrounded by impregnable barriers. Vinson's affinity for the Navy was surprising. He grew up in the central Georgia town of Milledgeville, far from the ocean. He never served in the Navy. He'd never even seen an aircraft carrier before he served in Congress, and yet his support for the military and national defense was unwavering. In his second term, Vinson sought appointment to the Naval Affairs Committee. Cook explains, convinced that increased spending for national defense was absolutely necessary, he believed this committee would provide a needed arena in which to present his views. Serving on the committee throughout the Great War, he became a friend and supporter of the powerful Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The 1916 bill was intended to build incomparably the greatest navy in the world over a 10-year period. But with the U.S. entry into the war, priorities changed. Much of the large shipbuilding program was displaced, while the completion of smaller ships was prioritized. Despite the goal of creating a navy equal to any European navy, at the end of the war, the U.S. fleet was the world's third largest, and well behind the Royal Navy. What's more, following the Great War, Vinson found that it was not a particularly popular time to be advocating more defense spending in the United States. The U.S. shifted towards isolationism and peacetime austerity. Defense spending in the 1920s averaged just 1 to 2% of GDP. While naval appropriations had grown during the war, the nation quickly drew down. By the end of the war, the U.S. Navy fielded 33 battleships. That number had been reduced to 18 by 1925. Cruisers were also cut, from 27 in 1920 to 18 in 1925. The Naval Appropriation Act for 1920, passed in July 1919, slashed the previous year's budget from over $600 million down to roughly $425 million and actively blocked any new ship construction while redirecting funds to finish destroyers and smaller craft. Enlisted strength plummeted from wartime peaks of hundreds of thousands down to a permanently capped limit of around 100,000 to 120,000 men. However, there was a significant bright spot for the Navy, even in time of austerity, and the U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command explains the 1920s was a decade of growth in naval aviation. The air arm steadily increased in size and strength while improving its administrative and operational position within the Navy. Small air detachments in each fleet proved effective during operations at sea. At the end of the decade, 3 carriers sailed in full operation. Patrol squadrons performed scouting functions, and commanders regularly assigned planes to battleships and cruisers. Notably, the 1920 Act provided funding for the conversion of the Collier Jupiter into the Navy's first aircraft carrier, USS Langley. Vinson was a junior freshman lawmaker, only recently appointed to the committee when the 1920 Appropriations Act was passed in 1919, but he soon moved into a leadership role. Tennessee Democrat Lemuel Phillips Paget, described as a walking encyclopedia of all things naval, had been chairman of the committee from 1911 to 1919 and was ranking member after the Republicans took the majority in the House in 1920. But Paget passed away in 1922. Democrats made substantial gains in the 1922 election, although the Republicans retained the majority. But by 1923, all the more senior Democratic members of the Naval Affairs Committee were no longer in office, leaving Vinson as the senior Democratic member. But the U.S. had already agreed to the treaty that would further limit the growth of the Navy. The 1922 Washington Naval Treaty was intended to prevent a naval arms race. The U.S., along with Britain, was given a larger limit than other nations to account for the fact that we needed to defend coasts on both the Atlantic and the Pacific. The capital ship tonnage ratio between the U.S., UK, and Japan was 5-5-3. However, Cook notes, Vinson protested that the United States, unlike the other powers, had not even built its navy up to the level authorized by these treaties. In 1925, Vinson was appointed by President Coolidge to the Morrow Committee. Chaired by Wall Street banker and Coolidge ally Dwight Morrow, the purpose of the board was to investigate the status of aviation in the United States and report back. Vinson was the sole Democrat appointed to the committee, representing the House Naval Affairs Committee. Among its concerns was criticism and suggestion by Army General Billy Mitchell, who suggested that all military aviation be consolidated under a separate branch. The board's recommendations rejected the idea of a separate Air Force, opting instead to keep aviation integrated directly within the Army and the Navy, a decision that was critical to the growth of carrier-based operations. Despite being the only Democrat on the committee, Thompson notes, acknowledging his expertise and aptitude for military matters, the committee chose Vinson to author many of the board's main recommendations. A New Deal Democrat, Vinson supported expansion of the Navy when there was little enthusiasm for military spending, and despite the fact that his Central Georgia district had nothing to gain from naval contracts. Logan Nye writes in a 2020 article on the website We Are the Mighty, he struggled for years against 3 presidents, including Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. The opposition didn't just come from the administrations, though. Henry Carroll of Yale University explained in his Harvey M. Applebaum award-winning thesis in 2024 that the public's pacifism led to years of military decline, leaving the U.S. Navy in need of many improvements. Still, he notes, despite these political challenges, the Navy was able to rise to the challenge in the 1930s. From fiscal year 1932 to fiscal year 1939, the Navy would grow from a force of 114 surface ships and 55 submarines to 242 ships and 125 subs, with another 105 combatants under construction. Vinson would be central to this growth. Following the 1930 election, the Democrats took the majority in the House. Vinson became the chairman of the Naval Affairs Committee. He would remain chairman for the next 16 years. In 1932, his friend Franklin Roosevelt was elected president. But the path to reviving the Navy was still not simple. Carroll notes that Roosevelt had campaigned as no more of an internationalist than his Republican predecessors. FDR had to work with many dedicated anti-internationalists in the Senate to achieve his key domestic legislative priorities. Carroll explains that as a result, FDR was extremely reluctant to make himself seem like a militarist and risk losing support. A key element in the plan to revive both the Navy and domestic shipbuilding was to have naval shipbuilding included as public works, included in the 1934 National Industrial Recovery Act. This is what allowed the funding that would eventually build the fleet that would win the Second World War. But Carroll notes, however, the idea to classify naval shipbuilding as public works did not originate in FDR's administration. Despite FDR's great interest in naval affairs and belief that the U.S. needed a strong national defense, the inclusion of the critical words ships and aircraft, written into the NIRA as public works, originated with the House Naval Affairs Committee. Carroll writes, the main legislative advocate for public works funding for the Navy was Representative Carl Vinson, the chairman of the House Naval Affairs Committee and a longtime advocate of naval spending. Including naval construction as public works in the NIRA, as well as both the 1934 Economy Act and the 1934 Credit Act, was critical to funding. Vinson was the legislative push behind that inclusion. A skilled legislator, while the military called him the Admiral, owing to his support for the Navy, his fellow congressmen called him the Swamp Fox for his ability to successfully move legislation. In the first 9 years of his chairmanship, the House defeated only one bill that he sponsored. A key act was the 1934 Naval Appropriations Act. The act authorized the Navy to greatly expand up to meet the treaty limits and to replace aging ships. The act was commonly called the Vinson Act. Using $237 million from the NIRA, the Navy immediately let contracts for 20 destroyers, 4 submarines, and 4 light cruisers. This was followed by the Naval Acts of 1938 and 1940, popularly called the Second Vinson Act and the Third Vinson Act. These were the genesis of the modern two-ocean fleet that was already under construction when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. The 1940 Act was also called the Two-Ocean Navy Act. In fact, Vinson is frequently called the father of the two-ocean Navy. The period saw huge expansion not just of capital ships such as the aircraft carriers USS Ranger, USS Yorktown, USS Enterprise, and the excellent Essex class, but also the battleships of the North Carolina, South Dakota, and Iowa classes. In addition, these acts authorized hundreds of cruisers, destroyers, torpedo craft, and auxiliary ships. Vinson first saw naval expansion as the best hope to prevent war, and later as preparation for a war that the nation increasingly saw as unavoidable. Later, when the Naval Committee was merged with the Military Affairs Committee, Vinson served as chair or ranking minority member of that committee until his retirement in 1965. He helped to shepherd the Navy into the nuclear age. He refused higher office, arguing that he could be most effective where he was. Cole writes, when he was rumored to be in line for appointment as Secretary of Defense, his standard rejection was, "I'd rather run the Pentagon from up here." After serving 50 years and 1 month, he quietly retired in January 1965. And to be fair, Carl Vinson wasn't the only person that was advocating for the growth of the Navy at the time, and the Navy could never have grown were it not for support by other members of Congress, the White House, the Navy, and industry. And some people might argue that military spending makes war more likely, that him shepherding the Navy through its growth might have made the war essentially inevitable, and those are fair questions. But history is history. And what really did happen was that this Georgia congressman was more responsible than any other person for creating the fleet that won the Second World War. In 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson awarded Carl Vinson the Presidential Medal of Freedom. In 1974, President Richard Nixon honored Carl Vinson by naming the nation's third nuclear aircraft carrier, the USS Carl Vinson. The University of Georgia Institute of Public Affairs was renamed the Carl Vinson Institute of Government in 1983. His support for the Navy included support for Antarctic research, and the 16,500-foot Vinson Massif, the tallest peak in Antarctica, is named after him. The man who was called the father of the two-ocean Navy, who served in Congress under 8 U.S. presidents, passed away in 1981 at the age of 97. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.